We're up to our last plenary speaker, last keynote talk. So if you all want to sit down and we can get the show started. Kelly wants to have just a minute to make a little announcement, so without further ado.
Yes, for people that were here on the first day, we had promised that Stéphane Dion would be speaking to us. And unfortunately, he didn't speak with us, as you know. We had one of our board members that was very upset about this and contacted his office and found out that there was a mix-up with his office, and of course he did not show up. So now Stéphane Dion is terribly upset about this and sends his deepest apologies. However, for anyone who's organizing the next NABIC, we probably have a speaker already. So he sounds like Eleni and Stéphane will try to arrange a follow-up session at some point. So that's the good news. That's my announcement. So.
Great, excellent, good news. Okay, so I'm going to just do a 5-minute quick introduction of Roberto Gargarella. So one of the really great things about organizing this conference is that basically you get to pick the people who you want to see and who you want to hear. And of course, we reflect carefully on people's suggestions. So for example, we carefully reflected on Carl's 73 suggestions of speakers. I'm not far off, And I don't mean it as a criticism. I mean, we do like a lot of suggestions. But I was particularly keen to have Roberto involved in this event. About 10 years ago, which was actually the Bien Congress in Barcelona that David organized, at that time I started to get more and more involved with people in the Spanish-speaking world. And I kept coming across this name, Roberto Gargarella, and at that time I had no idea who he was. Gargahu, I have no idea. Isn't that the guy, Gargarella, isn't that the bad magician who, tries to capture the Smurfs and feed them to the cats all the time? But no, turned out to be a different guy. And as I became, more aware of Roberto's work, people kept giving me little piles of paper to read, like bedtime reading. I realized that really, in the Spanish-speaking world, he's an absolute superstar. So when you talk about social rights, economic rights, when you talk about constitutional theory, deliberative democracy, Roberto is a bit like Ozzy Osbourne, in the sense that the new bands now, every time you can see the influence of Ozzy Osbourne, well, the people working in these areas now, it's very obvious that Roberto is there. Either he's actually physically there, I don't know how he does that, he really seems to be in several places at the same time, or everyone keeps referring to his work. It's really, really incredible. So, and then much to my surprise, he actually did some work on this kingdom as well. And one of the best pieces of work, or the one that I really read, that I thought was amazing, is in Ruben's edited volume here on citizens' income and welfare regimes in Latin America. And I really recommend everyone to have a look at this piece. And have a look at the whole book, actually. I mean, the book is really, really amazing. Is Ruben here? Yes? So you owe me some money, right? 20 bucks will do. So when the conference came up, I was really, really very keen to get Roberto involved and was extremely pleased that Roberto accepted this talk. And I should say that he has just spent a lot of time in Europe. He just came back to Argentina to a massive amount of appointments and schedules, and he still found time to literally fly in yesterday, come here to give a talk, and he's going to have to fly out immediately to further appointments. So I am extremely, extremely pleased that he can literally squeeze this in. I mean, that's really, really amazing. So the official bio is that Professor Roberto Gargarella is Professor of Constitutional Theory, Political Philosophy at the Universidad of Buenos Aires. He is published widely in legal political philosophy, social rights, economic rights, American constitutionalism, huge amount of work. I just wanted to point out that two important recent books are Believers, Foundations of Inequality, Constitutionalism in America from 2010, and then the very recent one, Latin American Constitutionalism, the engine room of the Constitution. And I think we're going to hear several of these themes today. So without further ado, Roberto.
Thanks so much for the introduction. I don't deserve it, and I hope to be able to honor your words. I'm very thankful for all of you being here. I'm very honored for this invitation. So a few things about the motivation behind this presentation. In the last decade, I have been very much interested in the topic of basic income, particularly after inspired by the work of friends and colleagues like Roberto or Philip Ampari. Although my area of expertise is basically in constitutional theory. So what I want to do here is to explore some implications and some lessons that I learned studying the history of constitutionalism in the Americas, although I am quite confident that what I will say, thinking about the constitutions in the Americas, these lessons are able to travel even beyond the borders of America. So basically, I will be thinking about three periods in the Americas constitutional history. One I call the founding period in the United States. That would be the pre-constitutional period, like 1780s, 1787. In Latin America, that would be the 1850s, more or less. Then I will be thinking about what happened in the second century, in the 20th century, basically after the enactment of the Mexican Constitution of 1917, and then I will be thinking about some recent developments in constitutionalism, particularly in the end of the 20th century, which includes, for example, some constitutions you may have heard about, like the Venezuelan or the Bolivian or the Ecuadorian constitution, that also I want to say something about that. So the first thing I want to say is about the first period, and I will also, from the beginning, I want to mention that I will be thinking about the Constitution, basically composed by two parts. One related to the organization of power, so the division of power, the executive, legislative, judiciary, and the Declaration of Rights. So that's going to be in the back of my presentation. As a basic fact. So something about the first period of constitutionalism. The first thing to say is that from the very beginning there was a tension and a dispute between at least two different views. We may call them liberalism or liberal conservatism and republicanism. And this dispute includes also, I would say, very centrally, a dispute about how to think about what we would call the material conditions of constitutionalism. So what was necessary for the Constitution to become stable in economic terms, and what the Constitution would do in terms of the economic organization. The one thing I would say about this first period is that everyone seemed to be concerned about this, even though from very different perspectives. So typically from the Lockean side, if you want, there was a very strong concern about property rights and the protection of basic freedoms, like those related to contracts and property rights. And they also, both liberal conservatives and Republicans seem to be concerned about another very important question, very also particularly important for the Republican camp, which is the question of political independence. So you need to be politically independent in order to participate in the political life. Many of these liberal conservatives assume that the only way to have political independence was to be a property owner. So basically what they did is to restrict political rights to those who were political independent, so those who have property. From the Republican camp, that was also a main concern, but from a very different perspective. The idea was how to create a society of property owners. So in the projects of, say, Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson, that was very clear. And this is one first important lesson that I learned from them. The idea was that in order to have political, I mean, when you think about political rights and when you think about political reform, you need to think at the same time about economic reform. So both people like Jefferson and Paine were very deeply involved in the writing of constitution, but they also were very deeply involved in the promotion of economic reforms. They all had, for example, these very important writings about agrarian reform and agrarian justice in the case of Thomas Paine. Paine, as you know, is one of the first British radical thinking about what we presently call a basic income. So it's a very important antecedent in the fight, in the dispute for economic equality. Now, in this lesson was also learned in Latin America, where Republicans in the 1850s also began very involved in became very involved in constitutional issues and care very much about about economic equality. So let me mention a few important expressions of this. One coming from someone who was the president of the Mexican Constitutional Convention in 1857, and this was Ponciano Arriaga. Ponciano Arriaga said that if we are going to think about the Constitution, the first thing we need to do is to think about the distribution of land and how to ensure the basic subsistence for all. So from the very beginning in Latin America, at least from the Republican camp, which I would say was very important at the time, but became less and less relevant with the passing of time, it was clear that in order to participate fully in politics, you had to have some subsistent rights. I would say that there were at least two expressions of this concern. One was, I would call, an extra constitutional concern, so you need to reform the economy in order to make the constitution stable. So in order to have a constitution, you need to have an economic equality. So this was Ponciano Arriaga says, I say in Spanish, but his idea was la Constitución es la ley de la tierra, meaning that if we care about the Constitution, the first thing we need to care about is how we distribute property. Another colleague of him, Ignacio Ramirez, he went further than that, and he said, he proposed, and this was absolutely surprising for Latin American constitutional discussions, he proposed a basic income in the Mexican Constitutional Convention of 1850. So we are talking about the founding period of Latin America, and very early, some important figures in these discussions were already proposing a basic income. So in the history of Latin America, it was a central concern at a certain point of time, the need of establishing a basic income and to commit the Constitution to something like a basic income. Now, people like, and this is the last example I give about these early periods from the Republican camp, Murillo Toro became the president of Colombia at one point, and Murillo Toro also was deeply involved in the constitutional creation and constitutional discussions, and he was actually the main responsible for Colombia adopting a universal suffrage. After the first election, his group, which was a liberal radical group, was defeated in the elections, and all his colleagues say, well, you see that you were right, you were not right, we lost the elections, people are not prepared for politics, so we have to give up with this fight for universal suffrage. And he said, and this is, I think I take as a very important expression in early Latin American constitutional history. He said, no, the mistake was not to fight for universal suffrage, but not to be fighting at the same time for economic reform. So we need economic equality for political equality. So those of us who care about basic constitutional issues, we need to ensure for all this basic right of subsistence. So this discussion was very important in the founding period, both, I would say, in the United States and in Latin America. Now, concluding the first part of the three parts I want to present, what I would say is that the Republican view was defeated both in the United States and in Latin America. So the main constitutions that we adopt in the Americas were constitutions where the social question was left outside, was left behind. So the constitutions did not take care about, yes, thank you. The constitution did not take care about this concern about social equality. And so they became constitutions that reacted against those Republican concerns. So in Latin America, for example, what we have is liberal conservative constitutions. In the United States, what you got were constitutions a constitution that also defeated what was seen as the most progressive version of the anti-federalist project. And in both cases, in the case of Latin America, in the case of the United States, we got constitutions that I would characterize by their counter-majoritarian features. So expressing in a strong judiciary, a very strong president, in the case of Latin America, an extremely strong president. And that basic structure, although it changed, and I will say something about these changes, is very important to keep in mind because it deeply influenced the history of our countries till present. So we still have, and this is a first important message for me, I mean a first important lesson that I learned, is that we still have constitutions that in their basic structure are first leaving behind the concern for the social question and organizing, remember the two parts of the Constitution, organizing a structure of power which is very much characterized by these counter-majoritarian elements, by this political elitism, by this, I would say, burning the bridges between representatives and the people. So we can go country by country, detail by detail, period by period, region by region, and I think it's I would say, quite easy to defend this viewpoint. So the basic structure of our constitutions in the Americas are constitutions that were organized, created after a very strong dispute between, say, liberal conservatives and Republicans, where Republicans were deeply concerned about the social question, and many of them in Latin America particularly, but also in the case of the Anglo-American world, they were very much concerned about establishing something like a basic income. So connecting, making a connection, strong connection between the Constitution and basic income, but that project was defeated, and that's so a first important thing to say about the creation of our constitutions in the Americas. So that's about the first part. One additional thing. I think that good constitutional law is normally expressed by constitutional activists thinking about what's the main drama faced by our societies. For the Republican camp, it was clear that the main drama, the main tragedy of our societies, particularly in Latin America, but not only in Latin America, was the drama of inequality. So the idea was for them how to use all the constitutional energies in order to overcome inequality, this profound inequality. So the idea is not that we are going to overcome inequality through constitutional reforms or through constitutional creation, but the idea was that the Constitution was a crucial step in the creation of more egalitarian societies. That project was defeated. For liberal conservatives like Madison, the main drama, the main tragedy was another, and I would say that this was an acceptable understanding of the political life of the time, but was a very different understanding. So for Madison, the main concern was the concern about factions, so the concern about majoritarian excesses. So that's why that explain in a clear way, and that also happens in Latin America, why they use, clearly Madison in the United States, but say Juan Bautista Alberdi in Argentina and many others, use their constitutional energies in order to fight a different fight, which was the fight against majoritarian excesses. So they prepare a constitution. We have constitutions that in a way are very well prepared to resist majoritarian collective action. So those were two very different projects, and the one that became prevalent was this liberal conservative project. Now, this was also expressed by an institutional system characterized by a strong presidentialism, by distrust about majoritarian capacities of participating in politics, etc. But all those concerns, which may have been important at the time, were also concerns that were very problematic from the Republican side, and particularly for those concerned about something like the basic income. So let me go to the second period of Latin American constitutionalism, and here it plays a central role, the Mexican Revolution, which comes together with the Russian Revolution, but in the American this is an incredibly crucial event. So the coming of the Mexican Constitution, and that changed completely the subject, but changes in a peculiar way. So let me say something about this second period. In this second period, something very important happens at the constitutional level, but happens particularly in the area of rights. So remember what I said at the beginning. Constitutions are basically organized in two parts, one related to the organization of powers, one related to the organization of rights. What happened in the first period was extremely relevant, particularly in the organization of powers. It was created against the Republican project, a constitutional structure which was, for good and bad reasons, characterized by these counter-majoritarian elements, a very much concentrated authority, so what I would say concentration of power, which in Latin America particularly was an extreme concentration of power. So that's what we got from the first period of constitutionalism. Now we're in the second. The changes that are now going to come are not changes that are going to touch on the organization of powers, are changes that are going to affect the other side of the Constitution, so the organization of rights. This is very important, but at the same time very incomplete, and says something about the nature of the project and the scope of the project and the possibilities of the project to become successful. So in this period, after things like the Mexican Revolution, and the Mexican Revolution did not come from nowhere, it came from a profound social crisis derived from how society was organized in the previous century. So it was a social explosion. But what happened in Mexico was, on the one hand, extraordinary. So it was what we can call a revolution with capital letters. But at the same time was very limited what it achieved. Was both extraordinary and very limited what it achieved in terms of constitutional reform. So all the changes, as I said, came through the area of rights. This is one example of it. So Article 27, and then the second is Article 123. These two articles in particular were like introducing a full labor code inside the Constitution. So in one way, it was extraordinary, and for Latin America, this was the, say, great lesson of Latin American constitutions to the world. This was the first constitution in the world including social rights, and it did in a spectacular way. So it includes basically everything, every right you may imagine, or almost every right you may imagine. It was here, in basically these two articles. Articles that care about the right of the children, right of women, right of the workers, etc. But now, at the same time, this was spectacular, and this was something that also took place in many other Latin American countries, almost, not immediately, but in the mid-20th centuries. So this was extremely important in Latin America and in the world later on. But it was, as I said, a reform that, first of all, only touched the organization of rights, and then it was a reform that was created assuming untouched the organization of power as it was. So the constitutional reform now was very important for what it did, but also because of what it preserved. If you take, for example, what the president of Mexico said at that time, it was very clear. We are going to accept all the rights you want, but we are going to keep the organization of power as it was before. So that was extremely important. Many people see this example as a revolutionary example, as a revolutionary constitutional example, but it's also a very limited example of what the revolution achieved. So this is not only a consequence that affects Latin American constitution, this is a way of thinking about constitutional reform. Take, for example, the case of Canada and the Charter of Rights in 1982. What the Charter did for Canada is what these social rights did for Latin America. So, just, given that I don't have so much time, but let me say a few of the things that these changes imply. These changes were extremely important. As I would say immediately, it's much better to have social commitments in the Constitution than not having them. But first, this has nothing to do with what was the commitment of the early radical Republicans in the 19th century. The early radical Republicans, as we said, they wanted something different. They addressed the social question, but they addressed it in a very different way. Many of them, that was not the rule, but many of them wanted something like a basic income in the Constitution. Many of them said the only way to take the constitutional reform seriously is to accompany the constitutional reform, the political reform, with an economic reform, with a radical egalitarian economic reform. That discourse was not here anymore. So here was an incredibly important event that was followed in all the world, but was also a very limited one. And one consequence which this implied, when you put all the energy in the organization of rights, what you have, and this is also what you have here in Canada after the Charter of Rights, what you do is you empower the judiciary. So one of the institutions that the radical Republicans most distrusted, and distrusted for good reasons, are empowered by the presence of this right. Another second important consequence, which again, that doesn't say, I don't want to say things against this inclusion, I want to favor this inclusion, but I also want to highlight the limits of this inclusion, is that you make collective claims, individual claims that go to the judiciary. That's interesting if the alternative is nothing. That's interesting if you compare, for example, this constitution with the US Constitution, which includes no social commitments at all. It's very important if you compare with the US Constitution, that is only a negative constitution. So, Latin American Constitution, or say the Charter of Rights in Canada, are extremely important when you compare with a very liberal conservative constitution like the US Constitution, which has no social commitment at all, at least not clearly explicit. But at the same time, it's very important to recognize the limits of this project and how this project is very different from what Republicans wanted in the 19th century. How this way of thinking about the social question make a collective claim, individual claim, that goes to the judiciary, which is also very problematic, and in part explain why in all the world, after committing the constitution to these social rights remain like sleeping clauses, dormant clauses. So during not still, but during at least 50 years, in most countries, these clauses became dormant clauses. And this may be explained for different reasons, but one reason is institutional reason, which is the limits of this institutional creation. So let me go to the final wave of reform, and then I conclude with some final thoughts. Part of the few final years of the 20th century, in Latin America in particular, we have a new wave of reform. So, for example, mainly those that took place in Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, etc. There were many things that these late constitutions addressed, and I would mention at least two problems. that were very important, and these constitutions were trying to address. One was the massive human rights violations that took place in the region in the 70s, but that, I mean, accompanied a concern with human rights that appeared all across the world. And the second was to address the consequences, the worst consequences of neoliberalism. So typically, constitutions like the Venezuelan, Bolivian, Ecuadorian constitutions wanted to react against the worst consequences of economic, neoliberal economic reforms. So a few things that I learned from this constitutional reform. Well, one is that they say the globalization of the human rights question it turned to be very important everywhere, and also in the Americas. So many judges, for the first time, began to recognize that these social rights, economic rights that were already incorporated in the Constitution had a role to play. So it became more and more important to enforce social rights after these two crises, this humanitarian crisis and this economic crisis. So again, the fact that these rights, these social economic rights, were present in the constitutions, that was very important and actually played an important role and is relevant and say something, but also we should never forget about the limits of that project and how different that project was from what early Republicans wanted. So one first lesson of this final period is that the choice of including economic social rights in the Constitution, I would say, was not a bad choice, but was a very limited choice, and also, I would say, a very problematic choice. Basically, why, and I think this is the last comment about this period, if what the constitutions of Ecuador, Venezuela, or Bolivia show us, which is that for many people, and I assume many people in the world, and maybe people in this room, these new constitutions, like the Venezuelan, Bolivia, etc., are revolutionary constitutions. Well, that's far from being true. Those constitutions, it's true that they did something very important, which is they expanded the list of rights that was already very long. But I wouldn't complain about that. They took care, for example, and this is also something that maybe happened here, about multicultural rights, indigenous rights, gender rights, that were not being addressed before. So I would say, fine, that's totally fine, but again, that's very limited. These projects did what the Mexican Constitution did. I mean, expanded our commitment to social, multicultural, indigenous, economic, social rights, and that's totally fine, but they kept the organization of power intact. As I say in the book, it's like the engine room of the Constitution, so the organization of power remained intact. A short story about that before concluding. I was in Ecuador in the 2008 with the discussion of the constitutional reform. I was invited like an expert in participation, etc. And I was presented what they were going to introduce in the Constitution in terms of participatory clauses. This was spectacular, and those things, they are already incorporated in the Constitution. That's spectacular in a way. So I have never seen so many clauses promoting participatory clauses like those clauses. So when I saw that was spectacular, but the main question for me, and this is something that was a real disappointment for them, I asked, well, this is spectacular, but what we are going to do concerning the organization of power in order to make it consistent with the democratic commitment you show in the organization of rights? Nothing. Not only nothing, they did something that were worse than that. They strengthened the powers of the executive. So what happened in Ecuador was what could have expected. They included hundreds of indigenous rights, participatory rights, but every time, and I have been following the case, every time that the people or indigenous groups wanted to make those rights real, they receive a veto from the president. And that's not something against Correa or Chavez, etc. It's something about the logic of the Constitution. If you concentrate power, then it doesn't matter, or it's not so important if you democratize more and more the organization of rights. What we did in our Constitution, since the change in a particular way the organization of power, if you do not democratize the organization of power, what you're going to have is you're going to have those rights that are going to have enormous problems for becoming enforced rights. So that's something that you should have known. That so either this has to do with some hypocrisy or with bad knowledge, or you don't want to see what you're doing. So those constitutions I praise, and I read like some Europeans articles about the constitutions say, no, these are poetic constitutions. I mean, this is just rhetoric. I don't see that as poetry. What they did is very important, but it's also very limited, and we have to see what the limits are and what the problems are. So, just to conclude, I want to go back to the 19th centuries and the 18th century, and to mention two lessons that I learned from those early constitutional thinkers that I think we should do. I mean, we would do well taking those advices with us. One is an advice coming from a very conservative Argentinian thinker who was Alberti, who was the James Madison for Latin America, I would say. He was a very smart person and was one of the main responsible of constitutional creation in Latin America. And what Alberti said, in a very conservative way, is because we care so much about property rights, the first thing we are going to do is to tie the hands of the people, because we don't want the people to interfere with property rights. That, I mean, was a very conservative lesson, but it was a very important lesson. What he said is something that we have not learned. He said, because we care so much about certain rights, the first thing we are going to do is not to fool the Constitution, to put more and more rights, property rights, contract rights in the Constitution. What we're going to do is to work in the organization of power. So, because we care about rights, we work in the organization of power. That lesson, I think, we should learn, and we haven't learned, and that's a very important lesson. The second lesson comes from this former president of Colombia, Murillo Toro, who said, because I care so much about political reform, what we need is, because we care about political reform, is that I propose a radical egalitarian economic reform. So what would, he said, what would universal suffrage mean in a society where the majority had no guaranteed subsistence? So again, I mean, this is an advice coming from a quite radical political thinker in the 19th century. We care so much about political equality, and that's why we understand that political reform need to go hand in hand with economic reform, but a particular economic reform, an egalitarian, a radical egalitarian economic reform, ensuring the basic subsistence to all. So I want to conclude with those two quotations, saying that for different reasons, we people, I mean constitutional activists in the Americas, I think we have not been thinking properly about constitutional issues. We have devoted so much attention about something that is very important, which is how to include new rights in the Constitution, but we didn't think about those issues properly. We need to start addressing